fear, obligation, and guilt. I would argue that these three things are the cornerstones of the Jehovah's Witness religion. Find out why in this week's episode of the Jexit podcast. Hello and welcome to the Jexit podcast. I'm your host Riley, a former Jehovah's Witness who left the religion in 2019. So this week's episode is all about FOG, F-O-G, which stands for fear, obligation, and guilt. And quite ironically, I have a personal experience with actual fog that ties in very nicely to the subject of this episode. So I currently live in quite a tall apartment block on almost the top floor, and the block overlooks a large body of water. I've lived here for about 3 years. And sometimes when I wake up in the morning and look out of the living room window, on a foggy day, the fog is so heavy and so thick that I can't see anything outside of my living room window. I can't see the bank on the other side of the water. I can't see what's going on the ground floor. I can barely even see the balcony that's attached to my own living room. The fog can sometimes get that thick that when I look outside of the window, all I can see is just a vast expanse of nothing. I'm quite used to it now, but the very first time I experienced that, it absolutely terrified me. It's really difficult to describe what it looks like when the fog is that thick. But the first time I experienced that, it was as if the apartment had been transported from its original location into just a void of nothing. I'm probably not doing a very good job of explaining this, but it was something out of a sci-fi movie. It looked supernatural, and I was terrified. I am totally and utterly convinced that the fear response I experienced at that time was a direct result of being raised as a Jehovah's Witness. It's the same reason why thousands of former and current Jehovah's Witnesses, myself included, are scared of thunderstorms, because we were raised on visual and mental images of Jehovah God using the elements and using natural forces to execute his wrath and judgment. When I think back on my childhood, the very first nightmare I ever recall having as a child was about being killed at Armageddon. My mum used to play the Bible dramas on audio cassette for me and my siblings before we went to bed. And I'm not sure if you are familiar with these Bible dramas, but they featured a lot of sounds of thunder and lightning and Jehovah pronouncing judgment on various peoples, and even the screams of people as they were dying. And we would go to bed listening to these things. So no wonder I woke up one morning from a nightmare of dying at Armageddon, fireballs raining down on me, the ground opening up to swallow me. And it was really scary. I vividly remember running downstairs one morning after this nightmare and telling my mum what the nightmare was about, and her saying to me, "Oh, you don't have to worry. As long as you're good and you obey Jehovah, you're not going to die at Armageddon." Now, children often have nightmares and bad dreams. That's quite a common thing. But when you think about it, children's nightmares are usually based on a fear of the unknown. They might be afraid of what's in the corner in the dark, or what's underneath the bed, or what's in the cupboard in their bedroom. And the way to reassure a child who is scared of such things is to show them that there is actually nothing there to be afraid of. But a Jehovah's Witness parent who's trying to comfort and reassure their child after they've had an Armageddon nightmare can't actually do the same thing. They can't show their child that there's nothing to be afraid of, because the thing that they are afraid of is very, very real to Jehovah's Witnesses. A JW parent could never and would never say to their child, a fireball isn't going to hit you because fireballs aren't real, or the ground isn't going to open up and swallow you because the ground can't actually do that. The only way available to them to comfort and reassure their child would be to say that those things won't happen to you unless you leave Jehovah. So from the earliest years in the life of a Jehovah's Witness, you're indoctrinated to believe that leaving Jehovah is something to be very, very afraid of. The JW religion is saturated in fear. And despite the fact that the religion claims to be all about love, it's fear and not love that is used as a motivator to carry out the religion's practices. And this strategy of using fear as a motivator isn't limited to Jehovah's Witness children. It carries on right through to adulthood. Take the preaching work, for example, the thing that Jehovah's Witnesses are most known for. The preaching work is all but dead at the moment, but let's go back to pre-COVID times, when it was very much alive and kicking. If a Jehovah's Witness were to knock on your door and you asked them why they do the work that they do, going from house to house, preaching the Bible, 9 times out of 10, the response you'd receive would be a message about love, their love for people and their desire to save people's lives from Armageddon. Publicly, the preaching work is all about love, but privately, it's actually about fear, because Jehovah's Witnesses are scared of being blood guilty by not doing the preaching work. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the JW concept of blood guilt, I'll just take some time to explain it to you. It all comes down to the JW interpretation of this scripture. This is what it says in Ezekiel chapter 3, verses 18 and 19. And this is Jehovah speaking. When I say to someone wicked, you will surely die, but you do not warn him, and you fail to speak in order to warn the wicked one to turn from his wicked course so that he may stay alive. He will die for his error because he is wicked, but I will ask his blood back from you. But if you warn someone wicked and he does not turn back from his wickedness and from his wicked course, he will die for his error, but you will certainly save your own life. End quote. So Jehovah's Witnesses see themselves in this scripture. When they turn up at your door on a Saturday morning, they're not just trying to save your life, they're trying to save their own. Because to them, Jehovah has pronounced a judgment message against you for being wicked. And if they fail to warn you from your wicked ways, it's going to be their fault when you die, which will mean that they themselves will have to die. I speak from personal experience when I say I have felt this fear, both as a current and former Jehovah's Witness. When the pandemic started and the UK went into its very first lockdown, I was newly out of the Jehovah's Witness religion. I was a baby worldly person, so to speak. But I hadn't yet deconverted. I still believed that the religion was the truth. I was POMI, as we say in the XJW community, which stands for physically out, mentally in. And I was thoroughly convinced that the events I was seeing in the world was the lead up to the Great Tribulation and ultimately Armageddon. And it was the most terrifying time of my life. As a disfellowship person, It felt like living on death row. You know you are going to die soon. It's just a matter of when. But there was something that terrified me even more than the prospect of my own imminent death. And that was the deaths of people I cared about who were not Jehovah's Witnesses. And it quite literally kept me up at night. I would have nightmares of all of my non-JW friends, family, and co-workers beating down my door, telling me that Armageddon is coming, they're all going to die, and it's all my fault because I didn't bring them into my religion. And the things I'm telling you are not just my personal experience, and it's not exaggerated either. In recent years, former governing body member Tony Morris gave a talk at a convention, which has now become infamous in the ex-JW community. I think the talk may have been removed from the jw.org website since Tony Morris is no longer a governing body member, but the clip is floating around on the internet somewhere. If I can find it, I'll leave a link to it in the description below. But basically, in this talk, he was saying that if you don't go out on the ministry, you have blood on your hands. And he actually encouraged the audience members to look at their hands and visualize blood on their hands if they don't go out on the ministry to preach or don't go out enough. So I'm honestly not making any of this up. These aren't apostate lies. So that is the fear that's associated with being a Jehovah's Witness. What about the O in our FOG acronym, the obligation? Well, the ministry is a good example of this as well, because Jehovah's Witnesses are obligated to submit a field service report at the end of each month to show that they engaged in this preaching activity. Now, the report they submit has changed in recent months. Now it's just a box that they tick to indicate that they engaged in ministry during any given month. But when I was a Jehovah's Witness, the report was much more detailed. Nevertheless, it's still an obligation. But everything I've said so far only applies to publishers in the congregation. What about pioneers? Well, their obligations are even worse. First of all, the limited reporting that publishers now do doesn't apply to pioneers. They still have to report the old way, where they submit how much time they've spent in the ministry, how much placements they've made, how much video recordings they've shown, etc. And pioneers also have a minimum hour requirement, a minimum amount of time they need to spend in preaching activity each month. Now, that requirement has changed so many times during the years. I'm not even going to attempt to try and tell you what it is. But suffice it to say, it's a significant amount of time. And these obligations that pioneers face are detrimental to their physical, emotional, and even financial well-being. For many, if not most pioneers, the sheer amount of time they have to spend in preaching activity means that they can't also have full-time employment. During my time in the religion, I personally knew dozens of JW pioneers who could not make ends meet on a week-to-week, month-to-month basis. So much so that they had to rely on handouts from other members of the congregation. And a large proportion of pioneers that I've personally known were all depressed. And it's not surprising given the nature of the work that they are doing. Having doors repeatedly slammed in your face, being told in no uncertain terms to go away, and that's me putting it very politely, is bound to take a toll on your mental health. This actually reminds me of a TikTok I saw the other day. Now, the person who did this TikTok is not a JW. They've never been a JW. They're quite a popular TikToker here in the UK. I don't follow them personally myself. But They were saying that the reason why Jehovah's Witnesses evangelize isn't actually to convert people. That's not really the primary reason why Jehovah's Witnesses turn up at your door. It's because the leaders of the religion know that they're sending them out to do a very difficult work where they will get a hostile reception, and that hostile reception keeps them in the religion. They're told that worldly people are wicked, evil, untrustworthy, hostile, and aggressive. And then when they face that, it confirms all of those things and makes them retreat further into the group. And they were absolutely spot on. The preaching work does not work. It is not about recruiting people anymore. It's about controlling people. But getting back on topic, facing this hostile reception day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, there is no way it won't affect you emotionally and mentally. And that's why so many pioneers are on antidepressants or abuse alcohol. And I've known pioneers who've done both. Another thing that I've observed as well is that a high number of JW pioneers, particularly women, seem to suffer from ME, which I think is more commonly known as chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, I'm not a doctor or a statistician, but I highly doubt that that is a coincidence. I would love to see a study done on this phenomenon because this isn't something that I've only seen in my experience. I've heard many others refer to this as well. So what happens if you don't submit this report at the end of each month? Well, after 6 months of failing to report, you will then be classified as an irregular publisher. And this label is tied to your standing or reputation in the congregation. If you as a Jehovah's Witness fail to maintain a good standing in your congregation, then other congregation members will start to distance themselves from you socially. If you're a parent, this will also affect your children. Other children in a congregation will stop inviting them to parties and get-togethers and so on. If you're single, it means that not having a good standing will make you a less desirable marriage mate. If you're a man, it means that you won't be considered for a position of responsibility in the congregation. So as you can see, not doing this one small thing of reporting your ministry has huge implications for a Jehovah's Witness. But the obligations don't end there. You're also obligated to attend all of the weekly meetings. These meetings last for roughly an hour and a half to 2 hours. There's one that is during the week. It's usually held on a weekday evening. And then there's one on a Sunday, which could be a Sunday morning, a Sunday afternoon, or a Sunday evening, depending on how many congregations share your kingdom hall. Now, during the pandemic, all of the meetings were conducted over Zoom. And since then, the religion has been struggling to get people to return to the Kingdom Hall in person. But meeting attendance, whether physically or virtually, is still an obligation. If you do attend virtually on Zoom, you're obligated to have your camera turned on. So what happens if you don't do any of these things? Endless harassment from elders. The harassment will be framed as loving concern, but it's harassment. Now, I'll be honest, when I was a Jehovah's Witness and I received visits or phone calls or text messages from elders when I had missed a meeting, at the time, I did see it as being loving concern. I didn't feel at the time like I was being harassed. But having said that, I knew that if I'd missed a meeting, I had to have a very good reason for doing so. I knew that I was obligated to give a reason for my absence, and that reason had to be a good one. I didn't feel like it, or I was tired, wasn't a good enough reason. If I refused to give a reason for my absence, or if that reason was a poor one, I know that it would have led to follow-up and even more probing questions. So whether I realized it at the time or not, it was harassment, or at the very least, an intrusive overstepping of personal boundaries. So those are just some of the obligations that one has as a Jehovah's Witness. Now let's move on to the G in our acronym, the guilt. What does this religion make you feel guilty about? In short, everything. There's the blood guilt that I mentioned earlier as just one example. But then there's also guilt over things that are quite normal, but are viewed or deemed as personal moral failings. For example, I joined the Theocratic Ministry School when I was about 6 or 7 years old. And from that age, I started giving talks and assignments on the platform at the Kingdom Hall. And I remember being taught that if someone ever complimented me on a talk that I had given, I wasn't supposed to say thank you. I wasn't supposed to thank the person for their compliment. I was supposed to redirect that praise or that admiration to Jehovah. And if I actually accepted a compliment, I felt guilty over it. I felt as if I was stealing something that belonged to Jehovah, because I didn't do that talk on my own strength. I couldn't have done it without Jehovah and his Holy Spirit. So if I accepted the praise for that, I was literally stealing something that didn't belong to me. Imagine being a 6, 7, 8-year-old child. You stand on a platform in front of 100+ people. You read a portion of the Bible, and you read it so well that after the meeting, people come up to you and say, "Well done." And you are not allowed to say thank you. Now, I did that many times. There were many times I thanked a person for their compliment, not just as a child, but as an adult as well, and forgot to say, "Well, Jehovah really helped me," or "I couldn't have done it without Jehovah's Holy Spirit." And the guilt that followed, it made me feel as if Jehovah wanted to kill me. And the reason I say that is because of the experience from the Bible storybook where Moses and Aaron struck the rock and water came out to give to the Israelites. Now, in that story, which I was very familiar with as a child, now in that story, Jehovah told Moses that because he failed to give him credit for that miracle, he would die in the wilderness and wouldn't get into the promised land. So every time I gave a talk and somebody thanked me for my talk and told me how good it was, and I forgot to say it wasn't me, it was Jehovah, it made me feel like I wouldn't survive Armageddon because of that. If you are not or have never been a Jehovah's Witness and you're listening to this podcast, first of all, thank you very much. Secondly, this must all sound so ridiculous to you. But I assure you, this is the reality that we face. When it comes to guilt and the things that this religion makes its members feel guilty about, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention what is probably the biggest cause of guilt in both current and former Jehovah's Witnesses. And that is guilt over sexual desires and impulses. The more time I spend away from this religion, the more I realize that on an evolutionary, biological, social, environmental level, sexual impulses drive almost every single thing that we do. And that is totally 100% normal. If that were not the case, I would not be here recording this podcast. I physically would not exist to be doing this, and neither would you exist to be listening to it. This actually reminds me of one of the deep conversations I had with my son a few years back. We would often have really deep conversations about a variety of different subjects. But on one such occasion, we were speaking about nature. Now, when I was a Jehovah's Witness living with my family, we lived in an area of London that was at high risk of flooding. The whole town was basically built on low-level marshland. So there was always a risk of flooding. In fact, it was quite difficult to get low-cost housing insurance because we were in a high-risk flood area. So because of this, it was quite common to see around the town, see around the area, huge portions of road, the actual tarmac of the road, or the pavement or sidewalk, as you call it in the US, where there were cracks in the cement or in the tarmac, and grass or weeds or other kinds of plant life were growing through it. So one day my son asked me about it because he was a very observant child, and he would say that he sees these things all over the place and he wants to know why. So I explained to him that the area where we lived was built on marshland. So underneath all of these houses and all of these roads and all of this pavement, there were actually plants that were being repressed. So all it takes is a little bit of moisture for them to grow. And because they can't stop growing, they eventually have to break through that thing that is repressing them. And I remember saying to him that nature is an unstoppable force. And when you encounter an unstoppable force, trying to stop it is pointless because it's literally unstoppable. The best thing to do in that situation is to try and work in harmony with it instead of holding it back. Because when you try to hold it back, ultimately it doesn't work, and eventually it will break through in a way that can be destructive. So when you see these cracks in the walls, pavements, or road with plants growing through those cracks, that's nature fighting back through the repression that we've imposed upon it. And exactly the same thing is true of sexual impulses. Sexual desires and impulses are a force of nature. They are an unstoppable force of nature, and it has to be that way or we would go extinct. But high-control religious environments fail to recognize that. So they seek to repress sexual urges. But no good ever comes from that. It's ultimately a pointless exercise because sexual urges are so strong. Instead of working in harmony with them, they seek to repress them, which forces those urges to break through in ways that are destructive. When I was a Jehovah's Witness, I was under the impression that worldly people were all sexually depraved and all the worst things involving sex happened in the outside world. But now that I've been a quote unquote worldly person for 5 years, I can tell you from personal experience that quite the opposite is true. When I speak to my wife and my non-JW friends about some of the sexual scandals that happened in the religion that I'm aware of, they have never heard anything like it in their lives. And this is all because the religion seeks to repress a force of nature. The guilt that this religion instills in people when it comes to sexual matters has driven many people to suicide. But the truth is that sexual impulses and sexual desires are not only normal, they are necessary and not something to feel guilty over. To finish up on this subject of guilt, I'm going to give you a personal experience of the thing that I felt most guilty about when I was a Jehovah's Witness. And as it's still Pride Month as I'm recording this experience is quite appropriate. So many years ago, several years before I left the religion, I was at work, and it was shortly after the law in the UK had changed to allow same-sex marriages. Now, I had a co-worker who was a lesbian, and she was in a long-term relationship with her partner. And shortly after the law changed, they announced their engagement. So a few people in the office on her team specifically decided that it would be a nice gesture if they bought her a card and some gifts to congratulate her new engagement and upcoming marriage. So they all got together and they had this digital camera that they wanted to use to take some photographs and mark the occasion. But nobody in the office knew how to operate it. So me being the resident tech expert, they approached me and asked me to take some photographs when they surprised her at her desk. And immediately I started feeling guilty. I actually vividly remember being so nervous that I started sweating because I felt that I was expected to refuse. My natural inclination was to accept and to take part. But my Jehovah's Witness brain was telling me, no, this is wrong. You need to refuse and have no part in this. So I was very, very conflicted. And that inner conflict caused a huge amount of discomfort. And to make matters worse, the person who sat on the desk opposite me was a fellow Jehovah's Witness. So I was very well aware that she was watching to see how I would respond. To cut a long story short, I ultimately joined in the celebration of this couple's engagement. I took the photographs. I congratulated her. I clapped when everyone else clapped. And when everything had finished and I went back to my desk, the look that my colleague and fellow Jehovah's Witness gave me, because she stayed at her desk. She didn't take part whatsoever. She completely shunned the entire event. And the look of disappointment she gave me, it was as if I was a traitor. And the guilt that I felt over extending that human kindness was immeasurable. I felt guilty for years. Every single time I remembered this occasion, I just felt a lump in my throat and pains in my chest because I felt so guilty for taking part in something that I knew Jehovah disapproved of. And the guilt absolutely consumed me. I even confessed, quote unquote, to an elder in my congregation. That's how bad I felt about it. But when I remember that event now, what I feel, and pardon the pun, is pride. I feel proud that I stood up for what was right, which is extending kindness to a fellow human being. I also view the way I felt at the time as being an indication that on a very deep subconscious level, I knew that this religion wasn't right because it went against something that was a core part of my nature, extending kindness to a fellow human being. And as we've already discussed, nature isn't something that you can suppress indefinitely. And I am so pleased that in my personal case, nature fought back and won. Thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this week's episode. If you did, please like and or subscribe to the podcast. And also, if you could leave a comment or rate the podcast, that would really help to get it in front of as many people as possible. Thanks again. I hope you all have a great week and happy Pride Month.